Salut and welcome to another episode of Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we're talking about mechanics. I've got 3 questions today. I'm going to actually get through all 3 of them. And the third one is a bit of a weird question. We'll see how you guys like it. But yeah, the footage in the background should be coming from Scaplis. So thank you very much to you. There'll be a link down in the description below if you guys want to check out their other stuff. Though I think I will use the majority of their Guild Wars 2 content in this video here. Before we get into the questions about the mechanic, first thing I did want to talk about was, yes, it has been confirmed that there won't be a beta this coming weekend, which does mean that for the month of May, this is the last weekend in the month of May, in case you didn't know, it does mean that there won't be a beta for this month. Originally, ArenaNet had planned to have a beta weekend out every single month, and to be honest, I kind of saw this coming, but they've just flat out said, look, we had a lot to work on after the previous beta, so instead of forcing another one out that people might not enjoy too much, we're going to hold back and we're going to wait until it's ready to have the next beta, which I think is perfectly fine. Don't forget, even though they did say that about maybe once a month, that was what they were hoping to do, they didn't confirm anything. They have always had the same philosophy that it will be ready when it's ready, and that's why they haven't come up with a release date, which is very, very smart of them, really. They've always said that they're going to do closed betas, which would decide the open betas, and then the open betas would decide more open betas and eventually release, and that's what they're doing. So yeah, anyway, there won't be a beta this weekend. When it will be, who knows, but they did announce that and some people have been talking about it, so there you go. Anyway, the first mechanics question was asked by someone whose name I didn't record apparently. Hold on, let's have a look here. There we go, Imperio-san, who said, the underwater content is strong in Guild Wars 2, so do you think they might add underwater or amphibious race? If yes, which one would be added in your opinion? I don't know many MMOs, but having water amphibious race with a capital located partially or completely underwater would be unique and awesome in my opinion. I feel that water beings are always underestimated. Personally, I'm planning to spend hours underwater exploring the depths. I would definitely appreciate if there were more dynamic events, dungeons, etc. located underwater, like 30-40% of all in-game content. Underwater, since the beta, has been an interesting topic for me because I've not really known 100% where I stand with it. Though I will say, I think most of my problems with underwater content in Guild Wars 2 right now come simply from the fact that the combat is imbalanced and generally just didn't feel that rewarding or that fun, particularly in melee underwater. That was kind of annoying. However, that aside, the actual environments that they set up underwater are fantastic. There were some moments where I just sat back and just looked at the screen and I was like, oh my god, this looks really, really good. The way the lighting shines in, like there was a certain moment I saw when the sun was like shining down through the surface as I was looking up. It just looked really, really nice. And the environments actually down there are pretty varied too. It was very cool in Keswick's Hills where you saw all of the crate structures and stuff down there near where the crate witch was, and how the water turned blood red when you got to a certain distance. And the same could be said in the Char areas as well. The Sunken Temple of the Ages as well in Godlost Swamp was also a very cool place. Underwater generally does look nice enough and feel varied enough, I'd say, for underwater content to remain really fun in Guild Wars 2, but only if the actual combat stuff is repaired, shall we say, or iterated upon and fixed a little bit so it becomes a bit more rewarding. They have changed the combat to work better in a 3D environment, which a lot of games don't do, so on that, if you're just comparing to other MMOs, I'd say simply Guild Wars 2 is already better. But really, I felt like a lot of the times if I had an ability that would sink someone down or raise them up, I didn't get much use out of it. I mean, it was kind of cool to see them move slightly, but particularly for PvE, I just didn't feel like it did that much, and I would much rather be just doing more damage to actually eventually kill them as soon as possible. There were some cool situations with Crate where they would throw nets and stuff that you'd have to swim around, which was pretty awesome. But aside from that, really, the combat felt a bit lackluster, shall I say, so hopefully that's improved for release. Let's assume that it is improved for release. Do I think they could release a race that was, as you describe, an underwater race? Well, first of all, the race would have to be able to exist on land. I could never see them releasing a race that would only be able to go underwater. That would just not function at all, really. Not unless the expansion that they released was like an entirely ocean expansion or something like that. But even then, that would never happen. ArenaNet wouldn't want to block content out to those players just because they chose a certain race. Whatever race it would be an amphibious race, as you're describing here. It would be a race that could be on the land and in the water. And in that regard, all the current races are amphibious races as it is. If you're talking more about lore, what candidate I think would be a good race for us to play as? I think See, a lot of people are going to be tempted to say the Quaggan for that reason. They'll say, oh, these are a very cool race, we've got a lot of lore about them, a lot of people really like them, maybe they'll become playable. But honestly, a big part about the Quaggan as a race is the fact that they're very calm and very docile, and they don't want to get involved with any kind of fights. And then all of a sudden they turn into the Hulk, and then these horrible, dangerous monster things that are filled with rage and just go on a rampage and kill and kill and kill. That doesn't really translate into gameplay very well. If you want that gameplay to feel similar to the gameplay experienced by other races, which ArenaNet will want to do. So the specific race, maybe it would be a new one that they'd introduce, or maybe it would be an old race that we saw in Guild Wars 1 that we haven't heard much about so far in Guild Wars 2, like the Naga. In any case, that's kind of getting a little bit into lore there, so we won't look too far. But aside from that, assuming they did find a nice race in the lore, I see no gameplay reason why they couldn't have a race that does start underwater and have a lot of their stuff based underwater. A lot of what you're describing here that you want to see about dungeons, dynamic events, and content generally underwater could still potentially be in the game. We've seen that there are some explorable areas, at least one, that is mostly water, and those places will be certainly the most interesting ones to see how ArenaNet can handle making maps that are very much influenced by the water that is around there, and most of the events will be underwater, and a lot of the chains will be underwater, and the renown hearts will be underwater, and I don't doubt that that stuff is in Guild Wars 2. It's certainly not as high a percentage as we originally thought it could have been. Like they were originally saying like a 50-50 split. ArenaNet certainly have moved away from that. I think maybe a 30-70 split is what we'll be looking at really for the launch of the game. A lot of people won't like underwater content, even if it is vastly better than what's available in other games. They still won't like it that much. A lot of people have stigmas against underwater content from the off, and I don't think it takes much for people to confirm that they still don't like underwater content if they go into the game not liking it in the first place. So still, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I do think it is good enough in Guild Wars 2 that eventually maybe we will have a race that's got a city based underwater. And if you've seen some of the areas in Guild Wars 2, the artists and the way that they've developed environments in the game really is one of the most standout things about it to me. And I think if any team of artists and creators of, you know, the textures and the models and all that stuff was out there for an MMO, it'd be ArenaNet that could probably pull it off and make it look as good as it could possibly be. So it'd be a very interesting concept, and I could imagine it eventually being in the game, but obviously not at launch. And some of the stuff you're looking for, I think, is there. It just wasn't maybe in the beta, and we'll have to sit on our hands for a bit until we get into some of those more high-level areas around ore. The next question was asked by Designs1293Y1, who said, hey, I've got a mechanics question for you. In other MMOs, they have a way of viewing equipment on the character, even if it's too high to wear. Like in World of Warcraft, I think you can shift and right-click and see how a certain item will look on your character. Because gear appearance is kind of a bigger deal in Guild Wars 2, do you think they will add this feature to this game? I certainly hope so, I really do, because you're right, it is incredibly important for Guild Wars 2, because they don't believe in a gear treadmill. All the things that are going to be motivating you to get more gear is how it looks. Guild Wars 1 had the same kind of philosophy, and I feel like to this day it was kind of conflicting on itself here, because ArenaNet didn't nurture that, and they didn't have features like this. In Guild Wars 1, you couldn't shift right click and see what stuff looked like before you bought it, and to this day you still can't find out what things will look like before you've bought it. You just simply can't do that, and that is a feature that's missing in the first game and is missing in the second game, and we've not heard about them maybe putting it in. I think I remember vaguely one interview at one time, they said that it was one of those features they might like to have at some point, but it's kind of fallen under the radar for them, and I don't think, since I haven't talked about it for a while, we should really expect to see it, though it would be very, very cool if they did end up putting it there. It was so bad in Guild Wars 1 even that when you were dyeing your armor and stuff, you wouldn't get a preview for a really long time. That was only an update they gave far later into the game's development. Luckily with Guild Wars 2, they have been very extensive with previewing stuff when it comes to dyeing, so the coding or whatever, there is at least there in a rudimentary form. I don't see why they couldn't shift this over to previewing stuff before you've bought it, and I would love to see this feature here, because as I said, I think it should be nurtured, especially for Guild Wars 2, where the way things look is so important. I remember in the first game, I bought some of the really, really expensive equipment, and Guild Wars 1's got a problem where they originally, in the first game, especially for the first 3 campaigns that came out, they really wanted all of the outfits and the equipment and stuff to look realistic and to be quite grounded in realism. You never had these huge, giant weapons that you see in like Korean MMOs. You never had ridiculously impractical armor that you see in other games, and everything always looked reasonably realistic. The result of that, though, was that Things like animations on equipment never really existed in the earlier days. It was only really added in later. And big weapons and equipment really didn't exist for a long time either. But you still had very expensive stuff that was prestigious stuff. But the only thing, because of that made it prestigious was how much it cost. As I say, I remember when I first bought my first set of really expensive armor, I was playing on a Mesmer, and Mesmers, when you buy gloves for them, they're like gauntlets or gloves that might look quite big parts of your equipment on other characters are actually just a very small part of the overall look of your character in Guild Wars 1 if you're playing as a Mesmer. I remember I spent so much money on these gloves, and my disappointment, it was, I tried to convince myself I wasn't disappointed because I just spent so much in-game money on it, but I was disappointed because the gloves were so small you could barely see any detail on them. No one would ever notice that I was wearing expensive gloves rather than some basic gloves, because really there was just so little there to them. It was just a colour which could have been changed by dye anyway, and that was a problem Guild Wars 1 had, and I'm hoping Guild Wars 2 doesn't have. I think this is actually a reason why you're seeing much more grand, shall we say, armors and styles in Guild Wars 2 from the off. It's to try and highlight these things, and I think to remove that kind of disappointment we had in the first game. So while some people still like that really grounded, realistic approach, and that is still certainly an option in Guild Wars 2, now we're seeing some bigger stuff to be there, and one big part of getting rid of that disappointment, as I said, that was there in Guild Wars 1, I think, is making sure people know what they're going to buy before they buy it. And a preview window like this, especially if it's in other MMOs, Guild Wars 2's competition, should be there. It should be there, and I think it would be a shame if it didn't get there for the launch of the game. I certainly do. Alright, here's the last question. As I said, a bit of a weird one. It's from Velissa Knox, who said, my question is, will Guild Wars 2 be easier to play than Guild Wars 1? I've been following your Let's Play, and you give yourself limitations before undertaking the campaign. Then you start going into missions that you are often even more disadvantaged by gear and current level. For example, in Tanakai Temple, you were under-leveled and basically using starter weapons and armor. I did the same with good weapons and armor, and I couldn't finish it at all. The same with the Heart of the Shiver Peaks and Crossroads, blah, blah, blah. So some examples there, Guild Wars 2 guys, you might not recognise. But this is an interesting question. What game is easier, Guild Wars 1 or Guild Wars 2? I don't think it's necessarily a question of what's specifically easier. Guild Wars 1 can be very easy if you have it set up in the right way, and I suppose Guild Wars 2 will have that as well. I think it's more a question of learning curves, and depending on what campaign you started with in Guild Wars 1, it could be a very steep learning curve for that game. That was one of the reasons why ArenaNet said enough is enough with Guild Wars 1. We need to make a sequel, and we need to plan it, and we need to future-proof it a bit better. The problem with the first game was they were encouraging people to buy a new campaign every 6 months or so, and with each new campaign they added more mechanics. There was more mechanic bloat. So new players to the franchise, who ArenaNet were really banking on to get more money from, those guys were having a hell of a time by Nightfall, just the third campaign, learning so much stuff about the mechanics of the game, and now all this new stuff, especially Heroes, added so much mechanics bloat, that it was just an incredibly tough learning curve, and it put a lot of people off the game, and a lot of people, just stopped playing, and that became a serious problem. Sales were affected quite significantly. So with Guild Wars 2, they've done a lot to try and streamline things, and a lot of people have been shouting about dumbing down and stuff like that, but really, it's in the name of making sure those more subtle and interesting mechanics aren't 100% relevant early on. So you can just pick up the game and learn to play. And you'll see in Guild Wars 2, the tutorial instance is pretty basic. It doesn't even feel like a tutorial instance in some ways. You're just playing through the first mission of the story, and that's about it. And that gets you to grips with the game. Your skills slowly unlock, and you learn more at a good pace. With Guild Wars 1, especially if you started with Nightfall, it was just like hitting a flat wall. By the same token, Guild Wars 1 also wasn't very good, that once you'd mounted this learning curve, once you knew what builds were, once you knew how to set up your character and your heroes, PvE became a joke. It became a complete and utter joke. You could, with the very exception of a few areas, which once again became like brick walls of a learning curve to get over, the entire game you could just stomp through and just walk through, and really with very little effort on your part, just because you'd set up your characters in a really significant way. And then the combat just became trivial in the game. Guild Wars 2, on the other hand, is far more balanced. It's got a less steep learning curve, and once you've mounted that learning curve, the game is still engaging at the top there, and it will still be a fun experience, which is very cool. I'm talking just about PvE here, of course. I still expect PvP in Guild Wars 2. They're trying to make sure it doesn't have as a steep learning curve as Guild Wars 1's PvP was. And that's a different situation, really, because I'd say in Guild Wars 1, the learning curve for PvP was really steep, even worse than the PvE learning curve. But when you mounted the PvP learning curve, you actually got a really rich and dynamic and interesting PvP game to play there, and it was really strong PvP, and the game was recognised for that. With Guild Wars 2, in their efforts to try and reduce this learning curve, they may have actually made the eventual PvP experience, once you know what you're doing, less interesting, and that's what a lot of people were worried about, and that's why some people are crying out about dumbing down with the conquest mechanic in PvP. I personally don't believe that it has been dumbed down, and I actually think that just due owing to the fact that the combat's so much better now, and the classes have been designed so much better, PvP on the whole should be more fun, but truly competitive stuff, there's nothing in Guild Wars 2 that comes close to the complexity or fun that Guild vs Guild, for example, offered people for Guild Wars 1. And that's just a fact, and that's something that's changed. But hey, I mean, when we're looking at expansions for Guild Wars 1, maybe that will slowly come back. And since they're not doing standalone campaigns for this exact reason, the learning curve, they can now have more mechanics below, I suppose, that doesn't affect things, because you're not going to have to worry about those extra mechanics until, you know, you're level 80 and you're hitting the new expansion stuff. And by that point, it won't be making the learning curve any worse. So I think they've really future-proofed the game a lot more. That was one of the core reasons why they started making Guild Wars 2. And to simply ask which game's easier than the other, taking all of that into account, I'd say Guild Wars 2 is easier to play, but also in general PvE, at the very least, more rewarding too, once you've learned everything you need to know, which really is all I can ask. That's one of the reasons why I'm excited about the game. But there you go, guys. That's Guild Wars 2 Daily for today. Mechanics. Thanks again to Scaplis for the footage in the background. And please, if you've got any questions about mechanics, leave them down in the comments below. I'm not so good with mechanics. I'll hold my hands up. I'm much better with the lore, but, you know, if you leave me as many questions as possible, at least I can pick some decent ones. I've been struggling with mechanics questions lately. I really have. So if you've got anything at all, even if it's just a feature, maybe I'll start doing that kind of stuff, explaining things like that. So thanks again, guys, and I guess I will see you tomorrow. Have a great evening.